Good morning. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Imogen Taotao Liu will defend the academic thesis, Investing for the State, a finance-sensitive reading of the transnationalization of Chinese state capital in Europe. May I please invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Thank you, Prorector. So, my dissertation is a story about the rise of China, remarkable for no other country has developed at such speed and scale. But more importantly, it is remarkable because its growth trajectory has been full of contradictions. Challenging ideas that have dominated so long about the benefits of limited government intervention in the economy. These two images capture well the contradictions of China's rise. In finance, the bull represents optimism and growth. On the left, we have the famous charging bull in New York City, guarding the gates of Wall Street since 1989. It represents the unfettered growth in private wealth and prosperity since the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s. On the right, we have a similar sculpture of two bulls outside the Shenzhen Stock Exchange in China. It is in many ways a replica of the charging bull in New York. It symbolizes how China's development has been inseparable from liberal ideas about market exchange, free competition, private wealth, and the benefits of globalization. Yet the optimism and growth that the Shenzhen bull represents is inseparable from the guiding hand of the Chinese state. And it is precisely the role of the state that has generated so much scrutiny surrounding the rise of China, scrutiny that intensified after the 2008 financial crisis. In Europe, the crisis prompted European economies to look to foreign sources of capital to support economic recovery. At the same time, in China, there was a policy thrust to encourage Chinese investment abroad, since the state has responded to the crisis with a huge stimulus, resulting in domestic overinvestment, leading to increasing levels of Chinese transnational state capital investment in Europe. I argue that this investment shows how the rise of China is a transnational phenomenon, meaning that it is a process involving not one singular state, the Chinese state, but a state made up of many semi-autonomous institutions that are capable of operating within, through, and beyond the nation-state. And that state-owned economic activity should be distinguished from privately owned economic activity, where investors of private capital are only interested in pursuing profits for personal enrichment. State-owned investors of state capital seek to reap profits and political goals, which in the Chinese context cannot be separated from the desire to catch up from a developing to a developed nation and maximize national prosperity by expanding the production of goods and services. My research was thus motivated by the question, how does Chinese state capital transnationalize? Transnational state capital challenges ideas about the separation between states and markets. In the developed economies of Europe and North America, the rise of neoliberalism has led to the hegemony of free market ideology. Economic growth must be centered around private market exchange, with a limited role for state intervention, only stepping in to regulate the healthy functioning of markets, such as enforcing property rights. The rise of China also challenges ideas about the relationship between the realm of production and the realm of finance. Productive growth encompasses manufacturing, trade of goods and services, and the built infrastructure required to support the development of industry. The realm of finance concerns the circulation of money via stock exchanges, through bank loans, and financial investment. In Europe and North America, growth in financial activity, which has largely benefited financial investors and capitalists, has seemingly come at the cost of growth in productive activity, which is necessary to support wage growth, employment, and higher levels of consumption that generates higher standards of living for labor workers. A transnational lens that accounts for the intrinsic political interests of state capital shows how, 1, the state has been an active participant in market activity, where it not only reaps profits for private gain, but 2, has been pivotal to the development of new markets to sustain China's growth. And moreover, 3, through the transnational investment of state capital, the state has actively encouraged growth in financial activity and leveraged financial activity to support productive expansion. And lastly, 4, I find that the transnational investment of state capital has created mechanisms that facilitate state intervention in European economies that contrast with the neoliberal norms that tend to be baked into European economic governance. I show this investment taking on two different forms in Europe. First, investment in Ireland and Belgium by the China Investment Corporation, or CIC for short, which is the world's second largest sovereign wealth fund. Sovereign wealth funds are state-owned investment funds set up by states to manage national wealth by investing into global financial markets. The CIC was first established to generate higher returns on China's export revenues. The other form of investment is public infrastructure investment, including the construction of roads, railways, and power plants in Serbia associated with the Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike financial investment, these mostly involve bank loans from the Chinese state to borrower states. I show that across these two very different forms of investment, we see a strengthening of state capacity across both in European economies. My research on these two different forms of investment was based on over 120 interviews that I conducted in Beijing, Hong Kong, Serbia, Belgium, and Ireland between 2019 and 2022. I also made 6 visits to active construction sites in Serbia. In the next slides, I present the results from my research. First, how is a state a market participant? The CIC participates in global markets. It is one institution within the multi-level Chinese state. It is accountable to the State Council, which is the equivalent of the cabinet in parliamentary systems, but it is also autonomous and competes with other institutions of the state for power. Originally mandated to generate higher returns in global markets, the CIC invests state capital like any other private investment institution. As I show, this is because the world's biggest private investment institutions manage the CIC's money on its behalf. 60% of the CIC's portfolio is outsourced. Moreover, leading investment banks and asset managers like Deutsche Bank, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs have helped to set up and design the CIC from the inside. But at the same time, CIC invests differently from private investment institutions. It also serves political goals. After the financial crisis, CIC invested heavily in energy and infrastructure assets, which aligned with China's energy security policy. It has also set up what is called the CIC ecosystem, in which the CIC takes on the role of a broker that has facilitated Chinese firms' entry into European markets through its investments in Western Europe. Through its holding in Heathrow Airport, CIC facilitated market access for Alipay, which is a renminbi-denominated payment platform in the UK. The state has leveraged financial activity to serve the real economy. We see this play out in Europe, where on the one hand, CIC investments in Belgium and Ireland have facilitated market entry and supply chain embedding for Chinese firms, and on the other, infrastructure investments in Serbia that build out a logistical corridor that can support the transport of goods and services between China and the European single market. These investments have created mechanisms that strengthen state capacity to intervene more directly in markets. In Belgium and Ireland, CIC has established co-investments with the Belgian and Irish sovereign wealth funds, where each sovereign wealth fund puts up 50% of the total investment capital. A good example is the China-Ireland Growth Technology Fund, which has served Irish industry. It has been a policy mechanism to scale up Irish small and medium-sized enterprises in China. In Serbia, infrastructure investments have taken the form of turnkey projects built by Chinese construction companies and financed with loans from Chinese banks. Because the loans are conditional on the selection of Chinese construction companies, the Serbian state has instituted legislative reforms that allow Chinese projects to bypass market-based public procurement rules that require construction companies to go through a public tendering process in order to be selected. This has supported the Serbian state strategy of using debt-based infrastructure development to generate economic growth in Serbia. So to conclude, these findings resonate with respect to the general turn toward more overt forms of state intervention across the developed economies of Europe and North America. They reaffirm critical perspectives on the hegemony of neoliberal ideas about development. They give context for a new era of contradictions, in which geopolitical and economic competition between China, the EU, and the US are playing out in a world that is more interconnected than ever before. Now I hand things over to the prorector.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Dr. Valentina Mazzucato, Professor of Globalization and Development at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Professor Mazzucato cannot be here today, so the question will actually be asked by Professor Cyrus Modi.
Dear candidate, I'm very sorry not to be able to be at your defense in person, but I am happy that my question can be read to you via my colleague. I would like to first start by commending you on your thesis. It is strong in its thoroughness and well-articulated interdisciplinary theoretical framework, which shows mastery of a wide range of literatures. It is also extremely well-written. I was most impressed not only by the quantity of interviews that you were able to conduct, but especially by the diversity of positions held by your interviewees, which attests to your remarkable ability to gain access to a delicate and elite field. It is precisely this interview data that I would like to know more about. What remained a bit underspecified in your thesis is how you analyzed the interviews and how exactly you employed a practice-based method. You clearly gained a wealth of information through the interviews, yet you seem to rely heavily on what people say about their practices, but little on observations of the practices themselves. Furthermore, when you present the interviews, which is not very often, they seem to be presented as facts supporting your argument. But as we all know, reality is messy. I'm sure there were contradictions between interviewees or between what people said and what they actually did, that is, their practices. How did you deal with such inconsistencies or contradictions, and why did you choose not to present them? And how exactly is your analysis a practice-based methodology, as you state in the methodology chapter?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. So, just to summarize, you would like me to expand on my use of a practice-based methodology, how I analyzed my interview data, and where I do use interview data in my dissertation, it's normally quoted as facts. If I could elaborate on this.
Yes, and the possible gap between actual practice and stated practice.
Okay. So I'll first address practice-based methodology. So my use of practice theory is actually both method and theory. It's an analytical methodology. The use of interview data and how I analyzed it is taken more from grounded theory, which is inductive. And I think that is appropriate to the research design I used in my thesis, which is more exploratory by nature. With the interview data, when I used, how I analyzed the data was first starting from breaking down all the transcripts I have collected from interviews into categories, to open categories. And this is where I'm able to go across multiple transcripts to find connections and cluster key concepts into appropriate categories. And an example of how I did that was identifying sort of the role of external asset managers in the CIC. So this is specifically drawing on data that I used in Chapter 5. This would involve identifying all instances in my transcripts where external asset managers were mentioned. Having done that, I also was at the same time making analytical notes. So in addition to just transcribing the data, I was also interpreting the data at the same time. So this was both collection and analysis. As for, and once I could cluster the data, that this would become, I would eliminate the categories or the concepts that were not coming together in a coherent narrative. So for instance, with external asset managers, it was clearly a story where they were a big part of the story, a big part of the narrative in investing state capital, Chinese state capital for the CIC. But then I would also corroborate this to avoid bias by looking at the annual reports, but also media articles. So when from the establishment of the CIC in 2007 up to, I think, 2021, which was when I was collecting the data, I went through LexisNexis and searched the keyword CIC through in the Financial Times, which does report on a lot of deals that have been made. So there was also systematic triangulation of the data. Yeah, and on the point about facts, so when I do use quotes in the dissertation, it is because those quotes illustrate, that they do such a good job of illustrating the particular observation or the connections identified in the data. So they're more illustrative than merely used as facts. And as I mentioned, for instance, with the use of the role of pro bono secondments in setting up the CIC, this was corroborated through not only interviews, but also from media sources and from annual reports that the CIC publishes. And another note that I will make about researcher bias, which is inherent to grounded theory, is that on the one hand, there is bias, but the flip side of that is the epistemic advantage of my positionality, which is precisely the bias. And yeah, so I think there's also value in recognizing the, let's say, the benefits of this bias. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think that nicely addresses Professor Matsukoto's concerns about checking the validity of the statements.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Gordon Clark, Emeritus Professor at the University of Oxford, and the question will be asked online.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. Or I am, of course, virtual rather than real. But nonetheless, let me congratulate you on your thesis. I think it's an ambitious piece of work. I also think it's got a lot of energy in it. It's a remarkable, discursive, analytical piece of work with basically a deep reading and deep understanding of the institution. So it was a pleasure to read. So I want to ask a question about geopolitics, which I don't say gets a short shrift in your thesis, but nonetheless, I just want to put a geopolitical question and get your reflections. So the resources or the assets underpinning CIC are owed in part to the trade agreement signed with the United States. And at the time, I don't think either party, the United States or China, quite realized actually the consequences of signing that agreement. I understand from talking to senior Chinese officials that one of the motivations behind signing that agreement was to free themselves from a relationship with the Russians. And it was a deliberate policy to do so, and that the United States was, if you like, a welcoming partner in trade, but also a welcoming partner, if you like, in a geopolitical sense. Now, I wondered if you'd like to reflect on that and then give us your take on actually the reemergence of the Russia-China relationship through the war in the Ukraine.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. So just to clarify, you would like me to elaborate on the role of geopolitics in my dissertation. And you draw on the example of the trade agreement between China and the US, which was signed at the time, this is before or shortly after reform and opening up, so well before establishment of CIC, well before the global financial crisis. as motivated by sort of China trying to pivot or de-risk its relationship with Russia. And how does this then, what's the relationship between this and sort of the pivot toward Russia now? Okay, first I will reflect on the presence of geopolitics in my dissertation before addressing your point about the history of the geopolitics between these great powers. So I think geopolitics is definitely an implicit theme that runs through my dissertation. In fact, I think perhaps it has motivated my research from the beginning, because it is precisely the scrutiny around the potential geopolitical risks around Chinese investment, especially in liberal heartland economies, that has generated so much controversy. So geopolitics, I would say, is definitely implicit in my dissertation. Where it manifests, I think the value of what I try to show is how politics, how finance, and how a lot of market structures and mechanisms that have arisen or have been baked into norms that have come from the market growth based on private capital has been a vehicle for a lot of political goals. A lot of political, whether it's developmental or it's geopolitical, as we see with the SAIC, with energy and infrastructure investments, right? There is a very geopolitical dimension there. So what I try to show is how geopolitics has been inseparable from economics, let's say. And as for the relationship with Russia, to be honest, I was not aware of this dynamic, let's say, triangle. This is like before or thereabouts around the reform and opening up period. What I do understand about China's reform and opening up and sort of this liberalization is that a lot of it was motivated by internal politics. So, or let's say, recognition that to not reform would mean political disaster. To not liberalize as a means to grow and develop and maintain regime legitimacy as was a fundamental driver of opening up and also dialogue with not only the Americans, but also with the World Bank, with liberal institutions, but also with post-socialist economists like Janusz Kornai, with sort of the Brazilian economists as well. So I see the domestic politics being a big part of the story as to why a lot of these alliances and geopolitical alliances came about. And I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Nanna de Graaf, Associate Professor in International Relations at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Thank you. And dear candidate, I also first would like to congratulate you on this dissertation. It is impressively well written, eloquently written. I'm jealous. I wish I could write like this. And it was therefore also a joy to read. It's also empirically very rich. And it's rich in the dimensions of China's rise and in particular transnationalization of its capital that it covers. I very much enjoyed how you highlighted the role of agency in legitimizing China's state capital, in particular chapter 5. I like how you engage with the debate on the resurgence of the state and kind of problematizing this notion of a dichotomy between the state and the market. And it's on that last point that I would like to engage with you and maybe push you a bit further. So you claim that you have shown how the transnationalization of Chinese state capital has led to a greater role of the state in the global political economy, also beyond China. But the return of the state, or the resurgence of the state, and the transnationalization of state capital, and the phenomenon you're studying here in CICs of sovereign wealth funds, are not a purely Chinese phenomenon. So what I would like to ask you is to reflect theoretically a bit on, first of all, so it's two questions in one, what is distinctively Chinese about the transnationalization of state capital and this co-constitution of state and market-based modes of capital accumulation? And second, what in this more general trend of resurgence of state-led capital is distinctively caused or driven by China? And what of this trend is just a more general trend that's inherent in the dynamics of capitalism and capital accumulation?
Okay. Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question. So you would like me to reflect on my engagement with the literature on the state-market dichotomy. Your first question is to ask me to unpack what is specifically Chinese about this resurgence of state capital. And your second question is about the more general resurgence. Sorry, could you please clarify the second question?
Yes, so this is not a purely Chinese phenomenon. It's a more general resurgence of the state, not limited to China. And you claim that China has played a role here. And I would like you to reflect a bit more, or be a bit more precise on what is the distinctive Chinese role in this general resurgence of the state.
Okay. All right, so your first question about what is distinctively Chinese. So as I expand on in my theoretical framework, it's the specific historical and geographical embedding. So yes, a resurgence of the state is nothing new, but to quote Anna Tsing, universals play out nowhere the same. And it is, I think, the particular post-socialist transition context that has informed China's developmental pathway and the role of the state, where we see, let's say, partial liberalization or a consistent sort of role of the state in fostering liberalization, which we can say is distinct from the sort of post-Soviet, post-socialist European context, where we see rapid liberalization, whereas in China, the state has constantly been say, a guide to reform and liberalization. And it is because of that reason, and also, secondly, because there's been a focus on production as the means to development. And this is also, we see that in sort of China's export-led growth model. So production, and all of this being related to regime legitimacy. And more specifically, in my dissertation, I focus on the post-2008 financial crisis context, where this is happening in a transnational context, where markets are liberalized. We have highly developed and integrated international financial centers that allow the state to act, the Chinese state to act through the market, which we can't say for previous forms of state developmentalism, like the East Asian developmental states, where the focus has also been on export-led development, but I can't think of much literature that comes to mind that addresses how this is related with finance and how specifically the state has used finance to support of financialization, so the proliferation of financial instruments, of actors and logics to support productive expansion. And I think this is where my dissertation adds value and speaks distinctively to the Chinese experience. As to your second question about, yes, so that I claim that China essentially has causal power in bringing about a more visible role of the state. So at a very concrete level in my dissertation, I think we see that play out with in the cases in Ireland and Belgium, where it's through these, say, co-investments that are a mechanism for Irish and Belgian small and medium-sized enterprises to foster their growth in Chinese markets. And this is, industrial policy, loosely defined. At the same time, we see a similar state resurgence in Serbia, but a very different character, where it has, the Chinese state capital has sort of given a political impetus for Serbia for the incumbent regime or President Vučić to foster infrastructure-led development, specifically a state-led form of infrastructure-led development. And this has led to governance reforms that strengthen the ability of the state to unilaterally bypass sort of parliamentary review to expedite Chinese state-led infrastructure projects. So this is where I show this in my dissertation. And on a more general level, like, China is a manufacturing powerhouse. So many key industrial giants have, like, maybe 80 to 90% of their supply chain embedded in China, like Tesla, like Apple. And also drawing on kind of the developmental states like Korea, Japan, a lot of their supply chains were also offshore to China. And they have actually, the national champions, a lot of them have decoupled from state interests. And then it's through China that we see kind of sort of North Asian trade go through Chinese supply chains into Europe, US and European markets. And in a way, this kind of global relational context reaffirms why the Chinese economy, where the state does take a more visible role in economic governance, has systemic effects. I finish my reflections.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Cyrus Modi, Professor in the History of Science, Technology and Innovation at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, I want to echo Professor Mazzucato and my other esteemed colleagues in praising your work. I was amazed by the number and diversity of interviews that you conducted and the clarity with which you explained the interventions that you were making. And these are much needed interventions. Indeed, I would perhaps even go so far as to say that you are doing the kind of research that deserves the label of varieties of capitalism, while the field that has that label, as you've shown, falls short in appreciating some of the actual varieties of ways in which capitalism can be enacted. And yet you yourself are a little ambivalent about this. So at one point, page 118, you say that, quote, in advanced capitalist societies, private capital accumulation ruled by profit maximization has been the guiding spirit of capitalism. That rather seems to constrain some of the variety. Elsewhere, you make the, I think, more defensible claim that, quote, the spirit of capitalism is always a work in progress. So I'd like you to say a bit more about what you mean by private capital accumulation and profit maximization. And in particular, I want to press on this idea that the profit plus logic is what distinguishes state capital accumulation from private capital accumulation. And I'd like to tackle this in two parts. So first, on the state capital accumulation side, there are many cases where even the most liberal states, perhaps especially the most liberal states, actively participate in certain markets with a profit plus logic, even where the plus so outweighs the profit as to simply drown it out. So I'm thinking of things like the defense procurement and urban and regional planning policies that gave rise to Silicon Valley, or liberal economies floating of unprofitable or barely profitable industries that have strategic implications: aerospace, automobile manufacturing, microelectronics, perhaps one could even say petroleum production. Do such cases, which have always been present in liberal economies and have even been existentially foundational to those economies, do they present any methodological or conceptual issues for your study?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. So your question, to summarize, would like me to expand on the presence of other forms of state capital outside of China. And you draw on a lot of examples from the US developmental state or hidden developmental state. My answer is that I believe I do acknowledge these literatures. In the literature review, the work of Fred Bloch and Linda Weiss, and sort of drawing on like DARPA and sort of the rise of the semiconductor industry, where the state played a huge role. I also engage with the literature on East Asian developmental states in my dissertation. So, and precisely to illustrate that we should think of this state capitalism or the relationship between states and markets as being far more fluid and more hybrid than what is, let's say, promulgated at an ideological level. One moment. When I engage with the concept state capital as profit plus, I use it and I use it to emphasize that the plus must be embedded in the specific historical and geographical context of the cases. So, for instance, as I mentioned with China, it's this post-socialist, post-transition context that really informs what that plus is. And I think with the US developmental state, I think national security is core to that plus. And that has and so I think this is a very interesting avenue of research, is to explore what are the motivations that drive diversity in state capitalist strategy, which is going to become a very important and topical issue going forward. But I think a fundamental question in sort of comparing, let's say, the US and the Chinese case is who's in the driver's seat? Who has power in this relationship between private markets and states? So let's, a topical example would be the ability to discipline private capital to serve decarbonization and the climate transition. So we have Green New Deal in the EU, and we have Inflation Reduction Act in the US. The EU will not be able to match the US in providing this kind of muscular industrial policy. And I think this speaks to not the absence of state, but the relationship between the dependence of state, especially in the EU context, on private capital to develop this kind of, to develop new markets, to be able to mobilize infant industries. Yeah, I think I've finished.
Okay, good. I'm very satisfied with that part of the question. Let me ask the more eccentric part about private logics. So does the existence of individuals who follow a profit plus logic, does that pose any methodological issues for your study? I'm thinking of people like, for instance, Rupert Murdoch, who certainly seem to enjoy making a profit, but could probably maximize their profit more if they weren't also interested in a plus of political goals, punching hippies and spreading climate denialism and so forth.
Okay, so private logics at the individual level. I think the example you draw on is a very fair one. Like at a certain point, is it so easy to distinguish between private and state logics? And I think we can draw on the work of Lenin here and a lot of the earlier theorizing on state monopoly capitalism, the work of on financial capitalism, on financial capital as well, where at a certain point when, there's so much concentrated private power that and that has co-opted the state to a certain extent that it's no longer distinguishable. In my dissertation, I think the value is to show precisely how these two, imperatives can be combined. And perhaps what best summarizes my approach is that the possibility for political goals to be achieved through market logics where private capital, where the imperative to extract as much surplus or profit is baked into institutions, into practices, into norms of the market.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Clara Weinhardt, Assistant Professor of International Relations at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Thank you. First of all, dear candidate, let me also congratulate you for this impressive PhD. I have to reiterate what my colleagues already said. It's really impressive how empirically rich your thesis is. Not only did you conduct over 100 interviews, but you also went to 5 different fieldwork sites. And I think it's not just an afternote, but really this rich empirical grounding of your thesis allows you to credibly make contributions to the academic literature, because there's a lot of theoretical and conceptual literature written about the rise of the Chinese state and so on, but oftentimes it lacks this in-depth empirical grounding. So I think this is really something that makes your thesis stand out. And you contribute to a wide variety of literatures, some of which have been mentioned already. I think it's interesting from international relations perspective that you're also contributing to debates on the liberal international order, where you portray China not as an outside actor challenging or supporting the liberal international order, but you show this co-constitution of the integration of China into the existing liberal economic order very convincingly, where it's not just China pushing, but also Western actors pulling China into this liberal international order. And this is where I also want to ask my question, because you do this by looking at the case of the transnationalization of Chinese state capital in Europe, and you present it as a crucial case. And I'm wondering, given the broad implications you draw from this, in how far is it also a typical case? Do you think the exact same logics are, for instance, at stake when we think about the transnationalization of Chinese state capital in relations with the US or maybe even others, Australia? So I was wondering if you can reflect on the generalizability of the case you've been looking at.
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your comments and your question. So your question is about the implications that can be drawn from my research about China vis-a-vis the liberal international order, where my research has mostly been focused on Europe, but how much extension can there be with my findings to other cases of, let's say, the liberal heartland economies like the US. So I interpret your question as basically a question about exceptionalism. So, you know, how generalizable are my findings? So I'll tackle this question at two levels. So one is that the cases I draw on, for instance, the sovereign wealth fund co-investments with Ireland and Belgium, where we see kind of this co-constitution, let's say, between you know, liberal heartland and the state capitalist economy, is specific because the US doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund, really. And although, I mean, I guess you have regional, I mean, federal level funds like Alaska. But I would say on a at a broader level, I think my findings are very relevant, and they speak to kind of this co-constitution, and I think this is located in narratives, current narratives now around deglobalization and decoupling, where it's not so easy to untangle these relationships. We just need to look at the increasing volumes of if you look at the trade data between China and the US, like, yes, there is some decoupling in certain sectors. The sectors where we might have a high fence but a narrow yard, to quote Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor. But we also have regular run-of-the-mill industries like textiles and don't quote me on this, I assume parts of agriculture, where it's business as usual. And we see this mirrored in Europe as well. So on the one hand, I think we do see like an escalating deglobalization and sort of a resurgence of this neo-mercantilism or geoeconomics or weaponized independence, whatever you want to call it. But on the other hand, you know, there are entrenched interests that prescribe the extent to which that can happen. For the liberal international order, I see, and I use this concept a lot in my dissertation, as the idea of the palimpsest, where we see new structures and new configurations of social forces that give rise to like different transformations in the superstructure, like global institutions, as building on that which existed before. And yeah, so for I don't want to say that the ILO is disappearing. Rather, it's taking on a new form that is going to will be seemingly contradictory, because we'll have, you know, free markets and open trade and multilateralism on the one hand, but then coexisting alongside this resurgent new mercantilism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for a second round, and the second round will be started by Professor Dr. Gordon Clark. Please.
Wow, quite a performance. Congratulations. One of your great strengths is the grasp of the theoretical issues, but also your abiding interest in the empirical world. And I've got a question about the CIC. And before I pose the question, I should say that I've spent a fair bit of time talking to the CIC, and particularly in its early development, where it was establishing itself as an investment institution and relied very heavily on international experts to sort of frame and implement some of its strategies. When I undertook interviews in Beijing with the CIC, and I was given access through very senior people in the Chinese government, I sort of came away often with a fairly conflicted view of what was going on. At one level, they talked extensively about their international focus. They talked extensively about their reliance on international experts and indeed international organizations like Goldman Sachs and the like. At the same time, I found it often very difficult to grasp what was the underlying objective of the CIC. Yes, it's at one level easy to explain. You're looking after the accumulated assets, you're deploying it for government advantage, subject to, of course, investment strategies. But why was I struggling to really understand what the, if you like, if there was a core objective? And was I right to think that actually it was at one level a game of mirrors? You asked the question, you got what you wanted back about CIC objectives, but actually that was a subterfuge covering up the close relationship with its sponsors in the Chinese government. So, a comment?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. So you would like me to expand on my impressions about the CIC, about the true motivations of the organization. To what extent is it, like any other institutional investor, and how versus how its responsiveness to its ultimate sponsor, which is the state or the party state. So I don't know about the idea of an organization having a core mission, and this mission, I mean, so much has happened since it's been established. I think the motivations that set it up in the first place, and then as an organization already in existence, how it then continues to survive, this context has shaped, has changed its, say, core mission. And I think also at a more micro level, how different asset management departments interpret that core mission might not necessarily come together in a coherent, say, story. So let me give some examples. So the energy and infrastructure investments. This was post-financial crisis, a lot of policy thrust for China to go abroad. And to further sustain for energy. And I think, let's say, for sure, this was a part of the investment mandate that either given or internalized by the CIC. I mean, there's no way I can really say where that comes from based on the data that I collected. But for sure, that's visible from when you look at the investments that were made at the time. Kind of this more narratives around Belt and Road, and around now, after the pandemic, kind of a more awareness of geopolitical risk. Like, I was just reading the latest annual mandate has changed over time. That reflects both the political interests of the state, the ultimate sponsor, but also the geopolitical and sort of, but when you do look at the investments, you see this kind of changing political mandate. Sort of a separate kind of speculative note, right? So none of this I put in the dissertation because I cannot corroborate it. This would be that you know, if I'm doing a grounded theory and I have these categories, you know, this would be one cluster of observation, right? And that would be that, you know, after its initial setup, where there was a lot of, you know, political impetus behind this organization, that it kind of died down. And there just wasn't as much political backing for this organization. And I think an example that was at one time, the chairman of the CIC was simultaneously the chairman of the CICC, and none of the board of directors were high-level bureaucrats. No one in the Politburo, and that this should be taken as a sign that this organization had lost favor. And I think also, I haven't read that much about the CIC. They don't want to draw attention. Yeah, so that's, I think, definitely something to look into in future research. Thank you.
For Dr. Nanne de Graaf to ask us a question.
Thank you, what an honor. Now that we're in speculative mode, now I had a question about method, but I think you kind of opened up the black box about this dialectical process of how you went between data and cases, and I think that that's satisfied me. So no, but the speculative question is, yes, so you talk about and describe very well this, you already alluded a little bit to this yourself, but may I invite you to reflect, how do you see this developing in the realm of finance in particular? And of course, China's role in the rest of the global political economy.
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question, which is about sort of where is all this transnationalization of state capital going, and this sort of increasing, you know, period of intensifying inter-imperialist rivalry, specifically drawing on what's going on in the realm of finance. I don't know about future directions, but something that does come to mind, I think, is what is happening with private markets. So for the most part, private markets, so private equity or things that are not publicly listed, kind of fly under the radar. Like it's black box. It's depoliticized because of competition law, because of trade secrets. It's like BlackRock, like what is the Bridgewater Capital? I mean, this is rumored to be, you know, having managed up to what, $8 billion US of safe money, so the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. So I think it'll be interesting to try and it's going to be the sort of workaround, the circle between rhetoric and reality.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for an excellent defense. Imogen Taotao Liu, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I hope for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future than even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. You won the battle once it's grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. Can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Imogen Taotao Liu, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Dixon is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please.
Wait, okay, sorry. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Imogen Taotao Liu, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dr. Liu. It gives me great pleasure to say that. It is a well-deserved title for a highly talented person with much promise on her horizon, not simply as a scholar, but as a contributor to key debates in the policy, commercial, and financial world. Indeed, just yesterday, I received an email from a journalist from the Financial Times, one of the world's premier business newspapers, who was asking about Chinese sovereign investment in Europe. Straight away, as you know, I told him he needed to speak with you rather than me. You are, and I have no reservation in saying this, one of the foremost experts on Chinese investment in Europe. When a few years ago, the European Commission wanted to understand the China Investment Corporation and Chinese investment in Europe more generally, you presented not simply to a handful of interested commission staff, you presented your insights to over 70 staff, 7-0, from various directorates including ECFIN Trade and FINSMA. Recently, I shared the introductory chapter to the volume we co-edited together with Milan Babic on geoeconomics, with someone I've been in touch with at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., which again, just to note, in addition to the thesis, was additional work that was not even part of the doctoral trajectory. But it was a collaboration and a contribution that nonetheless, Milan and I could not have done without you. And that same goes for the work that we did with Ilias. And here's what this diplomat had to say about the chapter I supplied him with in the volume. Quote, "Loved it. Really enjoyed reading it and have sent it to colleagues as well in the embassy. There's a context here that some of us have been discussing around our roles in the local national diplomacy versus strategic assets, AI, critical minerals, and infrastructure, which the chapter speaks to. Really got me rethinking about what we should be doing. Thanks." End quote. These are just a few examples. If I had more time, I'd mention more of your accomplishments that go above and beyond the thesis that you have defended today. In short, don't discount your influence, both actual and potential. It was no surprise then that you landed a tenure-track assistant professorship before the ink on your dissertation had time to dry. You may have worried about getting a job or a postdoc after your PhD. I never did. The phrase I said often to you, as well as our other collaborators on the SWF's project, Ilias and Milan, was, in it to win it. And you, Dr. Liu, are winning. But winning was never about how many papers you could publish, grants you could win, or job opportunities you could obtain. Of course, there is a game to play, and you must play wisely. You must always reassess your tactics and be willing to make moves that alter your strategy, even if the dislocation is massive. Always remember, as an important mentor of mine always used to say to me, it isn't a sprint, it is a marathon. Winning is about the contribution we make to knowledge, to society, to the world we live in. Why? Because there is so much at stake. And the contribution that you have made and will continue to make, and I'm in no doubt about this, is invaluable. The Netherlands and the West in general is increasingly concerned with China, and rightly so. Any semblance of liberalism that existed in China and Hong Kong is being crushed by Xi Jinping's authoritarianism. Yet, relationships with China run deep. For all the talk of decoupling, the evidence is fairly thin. Besides, China will be a major partner in any serious energy transition, is increasingly a major development actor in the global south, and let's not forget, most importantly, that Xi doesn't control the minds and the ambitions of Chinese people and what they have to offer the world. That needs to be explained in a measured but critical manner. There are certainly red lines, and we can't be naive. You, Dr. Liu, are in an ideal position to provide that explanation, both in your scholarship and in your growing public engagement. But I don't want to reduce you to just a China, and you shouldn't let anyone else do that as well. You are a scholar of European studies, of globalization and development studies, of international political economy, of economic and political geography, and I would also say economic sociology. With all the talk of interdisciplinarity, few actually do it and few are able to do it. That's the case with you. I will close with another phrase that I also frequently used. Go big or go home. For those of you here today, you've only seen the beginning of what Dr. Liu is capable of. She may be a fairly reserved and poised individual, but she is not going home anytime soon. Watch this space. Congratulations, Dr. Liu.
Thank you so much. Dear Dr. Liu, sounds great, huh? You have to get used to it.